Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining this penultimate innovation workshop on the final day of the live activity for our On Helix Digital 2021 conference. So this session is sponsored by DLRC, and I'm delighted that we have Dianne Lee, Director and Founder, and Vicki, Director of Regulatory Strategy, to provide their insights on this session today. So we're going to be discussing how regulators have adapted to support innovation within drug and device discovery and development. So I was thinking in advance about this topic, and it's a very important piece of the puzzle, if you like, which is sometimes overlooked by some. So I'm really look forward to hearing your expert insights on this. Just before kicking off, just a few words on logistics. So please remain muted whilst the presentation is going on, but please do use the chat box, which is enabled for your comments and questions, and I'll be keeping an eye out on those, and I'll be very happy to pass those to Vicki and Dianne throughout the presentation. So please don't be shy. As with all the workshops we've had so far, we do like them to be interactive and encourage delegates to get involved. And then also, if you would like to unmute as part of sort of the Q&A after the presentation, that's equally absolutely fine. So we are also recording, as you'll heard, and the session will be available as part of the on-demand content for the On Helix conference. So I don't want to take up any more of your time, so I'm now going to hand over to our two speakers. So Vicki and Dianne, I think you're going to do a bit of a tag team, so I'll hand the stage to you. Thanks very much.
Okay, so hi everyone, I'm Vicki Hayes. I'm a consultant at DLRC, a regulatory consultancy based out of Letchworth, and today's workshop, as Alicia has said, is around supporting innovation through regulatory interactions. And through the presentation, I'm really hoping to give some insights into how regulators support innovation in both drug and device discovery and development. As Alicia said, it's a sort of tag team effort today. At some point, my colleague Dianne will contribute, and also I'd like to introduce my colleague Indraj, who will certainly provide more expert input into the device aspects. Okay, so I'd first like to address why developers would speak to regulators during their product development, and why indeed it's important to do so. And by regulators here, I'm really referring to the regulatory authorities and competent authorities in individual countries who govern the development process and approval and licensing process around drugs and devices. And essentially, you can't really develop a drug or a device without speaking to regulators or having contact with regulators. Right from the very beginning, they would review and approve your clinical trial applications. And eventually, of course, they decide if you would get a license for your product. And then ultimately as well, whether you get to keep that license as you move through the post-marketing phase. Through speaking to regulators, you will get a greater understanding of the risks involved in your development program, and also that will of course help you put in place mitigation, some mitigation activities to reduce those risks and avoid unnecessary delays and pitfalls, which ultimately can be quite expensive. So you can certainly save time and money in the long run by speaking to regulators early. It's also worth noting that they should really be seen as partners and collaborators, and not just a hurdle, as regulators are experts and they can have some really good ideas and really help move the development program forward. And supporting innovation generally is at the heart of the mission of all regulatory authorities, as illustrated by the two quotes on this slide from the mission statements of both the EMA and the FDA based in the US. So just to touch on who you can speak to, as I said previously, there are regulatory authorities and competent authorities based in in individual countries. And this slide highlights the agencies within a couple of very key territories, as well as highlighting that there are national competent authorities based in each of the individual countries, and that includes the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency here in the UK. So in the US, the key agency is the Food and Drug Administration. I'm sure you're aware. In Europe, there's the European Medicines Agency, who are the decentralized agency of the European Union and take responsibility for the scientific evaluation and safety monitoring of medicines for the EU as a whole. And then, as I said, each individual country has its own national competent authority, and they are responsible for medicines that are not assessed centrally. They're also responsible for clinical trial approvals. The European Medicines Agency don't take responsibility for clinical trial applications in the EU. That is done at the national level. And the national competent authorities play a critical role in that they supply experts and scientific experts to scientific committees, working parties and assessment teams based out of the European Medicines Agency, etc. And as I said, following Brexit, the MHRA now is the key national competent authority for the UK. So developers can speak to regulators about all different types of products, from new chemical entities, biologics, through to advanced therapy and medicinal products, for example, gene therapy and tissue engineered products. So you can also talk to regulatory authorities about the development of medical devices. And typically, developers will speak to regulators on a wide variety of topics, including the quality development in terms of specifications, starting materials, impurities, etc. for their drugs. The non-clinical development to make sure that they've completed the right non-clinical studies to support clinical trials and eventually a license. And then key is discussions around the clinical development, clinical trial design, including endpoints, comparators, etc., again, to support your marketing authorization application. You would also, there are also very specific things you might speak to a regulator about, for example, in the case of an advanced therapy medicinal product or a combination product where you may not actually be sure which category it falls into. You can speak to a regulator about classification and just check that you know what you're dealing with and what regulations you have to follow. And you talk to the regulators right the way through the development program. So right from pre-clinical phase, before you've even thought about going into the clinic, you can be talking to regulators about the designs of those studies, moving right through to the pre-submission activities around your marketing authorization or your license application and into the post-licensing phase. And what this slide really does is show you, just for the EU, the US and the UK, that all the different mechanisms by which you can interact with the regulator. There is a myriad of ways of talking to regulators depending on what phase of development you're on and what type of product you have. And it's really worthwhile starting to think about really early mapping out some of these activities, because essentially they build on each other and they really do help to inform your development program. And in the next part of the presentation, I'm going to pick a few of these and go into a little bit more detail into what they can be used for and how useful they are, essentially. I mean, I should probably point out that it's probably possible to have an hour's presentation on each of these individually. So all I'm really going to do today, through the use of case studies and some slides, is give you a flavour of what the options are. And obviously then we can go into more detail in the question and answer if there's anything particular you want more detail on. Before I do that, I wanted just to highlight that the European Medicines Agency have specific provisions in place to support SMEs or micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. We have a dedicated office which provides regulatory, financial and administrative assistance to SMEs, and that takes the form of assistance by phone or email or in briefing meetings where you can engage in early dialogue with a multidisciplinary team to discuss regulatory strategies, but also to find out about available procedures, guidance and incentives. Also importantly for SMEs, being designated an SME gives you access to various fee exemptions and reductions for lots of the regulatory procedures we're just about to talk about. There's also assistance for translations. Some procedures within Europe require translation into all the different EU languages, and that can be time consuming and costly, and therefore that's a very useful activity provided for by the SME office. The application for SME designation is available publicly on the EMA website. The criteria are that the company has less than 250 employees. And I always get this wrong, but I think it's annual turnover of less than 50 million, or an annual balance sheet of less than 43 million. Does that sound right, Dianne?
Yeah, and that's euros. Yeah.
And that's euros. Okay. Yep. Good point. Well made. Okay. So I want to go into a little bit more detail about the options for dialogue with the agency. And this first part, I'm going to talk about options for early dialogue and specifically focus, given the theme of the workshop, on what's available for innovative products and methodologies. And the agencies generally really recognise the importance of getting innovative products to patients as quickly as possible, or in as timely a fashion as possible. And so you'll see just from the options available both in the US and the EU and the UK, or in all of them, that they've set up specific offices to really help and support developers of what they call innovative products. And that's really anything from a medicine, a device, or a manufacturing process where there's little precedence or is new. For example, the MHRA Innovation Office, which has been set up, it takes queries from manufacturers and developers of medicines and devices and manufacture and on specific manufacturing processes. And it really provides information, advice and guidance to organisations of all backgrounds and sizes, and allows access to the really deep regulatory expertise that can be found at the MHRA. It also gives access to other bodies such as the Clinical Practice Research Data Link and the National Institute for Biological Standards and Controls, which you may or may not have heard of, but the Clinical Practice Research Data Link basically collects anonymized patient data from network of GP practices and adds that to other patient data, and has built up a representative UK health data set which has been used to inform guidance and clinical practice. And so you get an access through this innovation office to that, and to the NIBSC, which is more focused on the quality and assuring the quality of products. So it really gives an access to more than just pure regulatory advice, and is very useful. In a similar vein, the EMA have, moving across to the right-hand side of the slide, the EMA have set up the Innovation Task Force, which provides a forum for early dialogue with applicants of innovative aspects in medicines development and methodologies. And really that's an more informal setting for early discussions, which allows the identification of issues for emerging therapies and technologies. And it's really seen to complement the existing more formal advice processes that we're going to talk about shortly. And oftentimes it is the first one of the first interactions you might have with the EMA, although one of our case studies will show that it doesn't necessarily have to be the first. With regards to the FDA, there is a scheme or opportunity called Interact, which is the initial targeted engagement for regulatory advice on CBER products, CBER being the Centre for Biologics Evaluation and Review. And this, much like the Innovation Task Force setting at the EMA, is designed to provide an opportunity for preliminary informal consultation. Again, this is non-binding, focused on innovative investigational products, and is really very early, even before you started thinking about clinical trials. And then ATMPs, as I referred to earlier, do have some special procedures associated with them, one of which I wanted to highlight at the EMA. The Committee for Advanced Therapies will work very much more closely with SMEs and provides the opportunity for an assessment of, for example, the non-clinical data well in advance of your marketing authorization application to ensure that you're continuing along the right lines. And again, this is not legally binding, but it can be had at any stage of the ATMP development process. So hopefully just by going through that, you can sort of see that there are lots of different ways of approaching a regulator, especially with regards to innovative products. And they are, in fact, quite informal, and they should be considered before you kind of start or very early in your development program to sort of start that relationship and get early advice. So there are more formal advice. There are more formal possibilities to get advice, again, throughout the development process. And we would recommend that at every key milestone, at a minimum, developers at least consider going and seeking some regulatory advice to make sure they're on the right track. And we would certainly recommend going for advice when there aren't guidelines around that therapeutic area or clinical or manufacturing process, etc., or where there are guidelines but they just aren't clear enough. It's also really important to go and speak to a regulator if you want to deviate from any guidance. Obviously, the idea being that it should have a good scientific justification for doing so. But you would go and talk that through with them to make sure that they also agree with your justification. As I said, developers tend to seek advice around major milestones, first in man, end of phase 1, end of phase 2, but hopefully you're beginning to get the idea that it's possible to speak to regulators at various points through the development process. A couple of key points on what the advice should be. You should be seeking advice prospectively. You can imagine that it's incredibly frustrating for regulatory authorities to be asked questions about something that's already been completed or where there's minimum opportunity to change the development program or what's ongoing. Even when you've started a clinical trial, it can be really difficult to amend it if you get advice after it, and the regulatory authorities really do like to consider the design in advance. It's also really important not to ask advice if you have no plans to follow it. So if you're very fixed on a pathway and you're just going to do that, whatever the regulators say, then you should question whether you really should ask for the advice. It's almost worth to get advice and not take it than not to get advice at all. So it's really worth talking about that. And really also, you should be clear that the way these meetings are really set up is really that you don't ask open questions. You don't really go along and say, how do we do this? But you should have a specific question and a position about how you're going to address it or do it with the justification, and ask the agency whether they agree with that approach. And that's really the form that it takes both in the US and the EU. Okay, so another one of these map slides that basically shows again just how many different types of advice you can get. And again, we're focused mainly on FDA and EU and the UK. It's possible to go directly to the national competent authorities in individual countries, and certainly that can be really useful to get advice on clinical trial issues or questions. As I explained, the national competent authorities are focused and do conduct the approval of clinical trials. So we usually recommend going to a local competent authority if there are specific clinical trial issues in advance of submitting the clinical trial application. And in something that's really positive about these, the local competent authority meetings, the process is really that a discussion meeting is usually held. So you don't just simply get the advice in writing, but you can actually have a discussion meeting. Obviously at the moment those are online, but hopefully we'll see a return to face-to-face discussion meetings in the future. You can certainly go to the EMA or the scientific committee at the EMA called the CHMP for some centralized EU advice that will give you advice that covers all of the EU and is bought into by all the EU member states. We'd certainly recommend that type of advice if the questions were related to marketing authorization application, your licensing application, in terms of and whether what you're doing is appropriate or sufficient to get that licensing application, especially obviously if it's going to be an EU application you submit. It's worth noting that there is also options to combine that EU advice with advice from health technology assessment bodies in the EU, and that can give you some really valuable insight into potentially how different the different views of the regulatory authorities versus the health technology assessment bodies who are in charge of reimbursing products in the countries in the EU. And the different views and essentially that can really prepare you for what you might have to do, not just to get the license, but then to ensure that the product, there is access to the product by the patients and that you're receiving reimbursement. That's a relatively new activity, but it is, again, it's very useful because a discussion meeting is usually held and the representatives from the health and technology assessment bodies and CHMP and the developer all sit in a room and try and thrash something out. It doesn't mean that you're going to get a consensus view, but it does mean that you get insight into both the thoughts from both different types of bodies, which can be very useful. I should say that you can get parallel advice from the EU and the FDA, and that can be really important for medicinal products where there are indications lacking development guidelines, or where you anticipate the US and the EU regulatory authorities will have different views and or their guidelines differ significantly. There is the potential, of course, if you manage to get everybody in the same room, that there's some degree of harmonization. However, that is not guaranteed from a parallel advice procedure, but it is something that I know a lot of developers hope for when they go through that process. The FDA offer their own advice separate, obviously, as well. You'll have maybe heard the terms Type A, Type B, and Type C meeting. Their meetings are categorized into these three types. A Type A meeting is really actually for when you've got a stalled development program and you need a meeting to kind of kickstart that development program, and you've faced some issues with the FDA, or you're on clinical hold, in which case a Type A meeting would be held. Really, the sort of standard Type B meeting is where developers will go at key milestone meetings, for example, the end of phase 2, and then they have the Type C bucket where every other meeting essentially gets thrown into that. And then I've also highlighted on this slide, essentially, again, because it sort of really directly supports innovation in trial design, is the two types of qualification advice, both from the EU and the FDA. And through those types of advice procedures, essentially you're getting a qualification opinion or a validation, a regulatory validation, if you like, of new methodology, for example, biomarkers, imaging methods, or even endpoints. So they actually result in a public opinion on, say, for example, a new endpoint to support Alzheimer's, something like Alzheimer's disease, and clinical study design in that. So they're really worth, if you're developing something novel in terms of a methodology or using a biomarker, looking into to make sure that you get this endorsement from the FDA and the EU, although these processes can be quite lengthy. Okay, so I wanted to kind of get away from just listing different types of procedures and give a case study which demonstrates how oftentimes you have multiple interactions with regulatory authorities and how these can build on each other to hopefully to a successful outcome. So here at DLRC, the team is working with a SME with a novel vaccine platform, primarily targeting therapeutic oncology indications. And it should be noted that there's little precedence and unclear guidelines in this arena. So the team here supported the SME having an initial meeting with the MHRA Innovation Office. And at that meeting, they really talked through the initial plans for the non-clinical development to support the clinical phases. And that was really interesting, because actually the tendency is to believe that regulators will essentially require more and more data. However, at this meeting, the MHRA actually really helped the team reduce the number of planned studies and focus the team on what studies were really necessary. So actually they came away with a sort of reduced non-clinical plan rather than having additional requirements sort of forced upon them. They built on that initial Innovation Office meeting with MHRA scientific advice on the non-clinical and clinical plans. During that more formal meeting, they gained agreement on the non-clinical study programme, and also gained insight into key areas of concern or issues with the proposed clinical study. Therefore, they were able to make some amendments. It's also worth noting that they had a really good discussion around alternative and more innovative trial designs with the MHRA at that point. They also separately had scientific advice on their plans with regards to quality. And that's actually quite a common thing, where because of different timelines on the development plan, the quality and the non-clinical and clinical advice are separated, and our separate advice on both is sought at different time points. But the scientific advice on the quality plans was really helpful in informing the creation of the clinical trial application documents and gave some reassurance on the strategy. So the team then moved forward towards a clinical trial application, and as plans were tailored and altered based on the advice from the MHRA, there were a number of informal interactions through email correspondence with the clinical trial unit at the MHRA, ultimately leading to the clinical trial application being submitted through the combined ways of working scheme, which is a scheme really a pilot scheme really that's in place to allow one clinical trial application and one opinion from the ethics committee and the regulatory authority. And the success was measured, if you like, by the fact that the CTA has been approved with only minor questions. I alluded to this case study earlier, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dianne to just talk you through another case study which shows that how you can go for different types of advice at different stages and how they all build upon one another.
Thanks, Vicki. So this was a programme that is now well underway through phase 3. But initially, we were looking at a new target mechanism of action for acute myeloid leukemia treatment. And the product that we had was fairly complicated by the fact that it was very insoluble. So we couldn't initially decide exactly what we wanted to go to the EMA and ask. So we went to 2 national competent authorities in Europe, Sweden and Germany. And the questions that we asked and the discussions that we had at those meetings really helped to inform the EMA advice. At that time, pre-pandemic, if you asked for a meeting with a national competent authority, it almost certainly guaranteed you a face-to-face meeting, which of course the EMA doesn't. So this meant that we could have a discussion around the various points, which was incredibly useful. So we then went for European advice, and then we had quite a large phase 1 program because we did decide to change the formulation. So we ended up with quite a large number of patients in phase 1. And during that time, next generation sequencing was ongoing, which did identify a 4-gene signature for responders to the treatment. Now, of course, this gives an opportunity for using a biomarker for patients that will respond. But this was quite a new concept. So at that point, which was after a significant amount of advice had been sought in Europe and in national member states, the company did go to the Innovation Task Force at that point to talk about how the 4-gene signature might be used in patient selection. So I think this really demonstrates that you don't have to go to the Innovation Task Force right at the beginning of your program. It's something that if something comes up during the development, you can still go to Innovation Task Force to ask those questions, because it's a different sort of forum that allows experts from around Europe, from the large cohort of experts that support the European Medicines Agency. Anyone can basically come along to that meeting if they have something that they wish to say. And I think we had 19 or 20 individuals that turned up to voice an opinion on what we were proposing to do with the programme, which was incredibly useful. Now I think I'm handing over to Indra, who's going to go through some devices information.
Thanks, Dianne. So in Europe currently, in addition to with early scientific advice, we'd have to currently go to national competent authorities. So as we saw earlier, in the UK, we have the MHRA that supports with the UK Innovation Office if you have any devices queries. However, if you have a European specific query or you need some early advice, you would have to go to your national competent authority or wherever your authorized representative is based. And the information, the help they can give you is based around device classification, mostly borderline devices. So whether your device is your product, is a medicine or a device or a combination. They can also assist with classification of devices where the classification is not quite clear. The other things they can help with is things like your clinical development strategies and also clinical investigation proposals, looking at clinical endpoints, your clinical cohort numbers and all things like that. So unfortunately, with this model, what you might find is that one national competent authority may have a different view to another competent authority. Therefore, getting an EU harmonization may be slightly difficult. However, this is being addressed with the new medical device and in vitro medical device regulations. The EU Commission is setting up expert panels, and this is an activity that is underway. They have around, I think, 12 expert panels which cover all therapeutic areas, so things like orthopedics, respiratory systems, neurology, in vitro diagnostic devices, and they're intended to provide early advice to manufacturers on novel products and very high-risk products. And they would be able to give you scientific and technical advice, and also advice on your clinical development strategy and proposals for clinical investigations. However, while these expert panels are being set up, they're not quite available to manufacturers as yet. They're only working with notified bodies to give them opinions on their assessments of clinical evaluations, but we are hoping that over the next year or so, they will become a lot more functional and available for device developers to seek advice from. So watch this space, I suppose.
Thank you very much, Indraj. So having covered how you might go and seek scientific advice or advice from regulators throughout development, there are a number of other mechanisms and schemes available from the regulatory authorities to both add value and expedite development, specifically with a focus on products designed to treat life-threatening or serious diseases, rare diseases, and where there's a high unmet medical need. I just wanted to highlight a few of those as well. Again, the map slide will show us some of the key activities or schemes available. So starting on the left-hand side and with the US, I wanted to highlight fast track designation. Fast track designation by the US is essentially to facilitate the development and expedite the review of drugs, as I said, to treat serious conditions and fulfill an unmet medical need. And once a drug has received fast track designation, there is an expectation that there will be many more frequent meetings with the US throughout the development process to ensure that essentially that the development remains on track and that key issues are highlighted at as early a time point as possible. Fast track designation also allows access if the other eligibility criteria are met to priority, accelerated or a rolling review. And these are specific types of review mechanisms for licensing applications, which are designed to speed up that process. And there's a slide on that towards the end of the presentation. A slightly newer designation that the US have introduced is breakthrough designation. Again, this is designed to expedite the development and review of drugs, again for serious conditions that have already got data which supports the fact that you will see a substantial improvement over available therapy on a clinically significant endpoint. And again, this designation can be sought as early as phase 1. And it has all the criteria and designation features of fast track, but and in addition, the website says that senior management get involved in the development program. Senior management from the FDA get involved, and there's intensive guidance on an efficient drug development program. So fast track and breakthrough sound very similar. It is a bit of there is a nuance to it in that fast track is for drugs which are showing potential to fulfill an unmet medical need. Breakthrough is where there's some actual clinical data available to show that there will be a significant improvement over available therapies. And essentially, it's not that uncommon actually that a drug might receive fast track designation early and slightly later then go on to get breakthrough designation. So Indraj, would you like to take the opportunity to just comment on breakthrough for devices?
Yes, thank you, Vicki. So similarly to the breakthrough program for devices, which are medical devices or in vitro diagnostic or combination products that are led by the device, which are intended to treat or diagnose life-threatening or irreversible conditions, you can apply for the Breakthrough Devices Program. And this program is intended to provide patients and healthcare providers with timely access by speeding up development and assessment and review of such products. It's a program that helps developers expedite development, assessment, and review. So what you would get is if the FDA would grant this designation to your device, you get early collaboration and interaction with FDA experts who can give you input on your device development, your clinical investigation plans, any preclinical testing, animal studies and things like that. And generally they hold sprint discussions. So these are like very short. There's several types of discussions that you could have with the FDA, which could be focused on one topic. And they generally address any novel issues that are related to the device that the developer is seeing. You would also benefit from priority review of your application. The breakthrough designation is requested by a Q submission, and I think it takes around 60 days to be granted. You would be eligible if you are in. It's a voluntary program, but you are eligible if you are intending to submit an application to the FDA. So an IDE application, an HDE application, 510K, PMA, or de novo request. So similar to the Breakthrough Devices program, they have the Safer Technologies program, or the STEP. But this is intended for devices that are intended to treat non-threatening or reasonably reversible conditions. And similarly, you'd get early engagement and timely FDA feedback, priority review, and again, it's a voluntary program for device manufacturers. Thanks, Vicki.
Before we move on from this slide, just highlight a couple of schemes available in the EU and the UK. So the PRIME scheme was released a few years back from the EMA to really support the development of medicines which address an unmet medical need. And if you are designated a PRIME molecule, i.e. one that is designed to address a serious and life-threatening condition and address an unmet medical need, you will have an early appointment of the key agencies involved in your review, so your rapporteur, and you'll have much more frequent dialogue with the agencies throughout the development, and early guidance from experts on the development plan and the recommended regulatory pathway for the molecule. So support from the agency starts much earlier, and you get much more hand-holding in terms of how you go through your development programme. Again, the UK have very recently, following Brexit, also produced released their version in a way of PRIME, which actually looks to be very comprehensive. That this is called the ILAP scheme, and that is a platform for a sustained collaborative working between the MHRA partners and the medicines developer. And I should say that in this case, the MHRA's partner is the NICE, and the Scottish version of NICE, the SMC. Also wanted to highlight, just for products developed for rare diseases, that it is possible to have those types of products designated as orphan medicinal products, both in the EU and the US. Both in both regions, orphan designation is designed to support the development of products for rare diseases through a set of incentives, which include free scientific advice, reduction of fees for other regulatory activities, and importantly, 10 years of market exclusivity once you've gained approval. In the US, that's 7 years of marketing exclusivity. The criteria for orphan designation in the EU and the US are outlined on this slide. Essentially, again, the product in the EU, the product has to be designed for the treatment, prevention, or diagnosis of a disease that is life-threatening or chronically debilitating, but also has a prevalence of less than 5 in 10,000. Or that the other option is that you can apply on the basis that the marketing of the product would not generate sufficient returns to justify the investment needed for development. And we can go into that in more detail in the questions if needs be. Couldn't really do this presentation without mentioning pediatrics, essentially because I think, based on my experience, this is one area where there is frequent interactions with the regulators, now. So essentially, back a few years ago, both regions, the European and the FDA, made it mandatory to complete clinical studies in pediatrics prior to or in parallel to submitting a marketing authorization application for an adult license. It is really important that these get agreed and approved by the regulatory authorities. It can be quite a lengthy process, but essentially you do need to get them approved, because without them, your license application won't be approved. So a pediatric investigational plan in Europe will cover a plan to develop in children all aspects, the quality, so a pediatric formulation, and non-clinical, so juvenile toxicology as necessary, and then of course a clinical plan in children, clinical studies in children as necessary. And within that plan, it will be clear and binding as to which studies have to be completed before the MAA submission, or indeed which studies can be deferred. And there are certain products, types of products and therapeutic areas where you can achieve a waiver, but you have to apply for that waiver in advance for the agency. The pediatric plan is supposed to be submitted at the time of completion of the adult phase 1 study, so it really is intended that pediatric development occurs in parallel to development of the adults, and you do get a reward for doing that. If all the studies are completed per the pediatric development plan, then you receive a 6-month extension on your supplementary patent certificate, or in the case of an orphan product, you would receive a 2-year extension of orphan exclusivity. And the US have very similar requirements. There are, of course, nuances, which are probably not important to go into today, but when you're considering a development plan for any product, it's very important early on to think about how you're going to develop the product also for pediatrics, or indeed if it's relevant to develop the product for pediatrics as well. So this very busy slide is intended to show a case study for a product with for a pediatric orphan disease where there's no regulatory guidance. And again, I think it serves to highlight just how many different interactions you may be having with the regulatory authorities, especially if you are developing from a global perspective. This would be multiplied up across the number of agencies and in the territories and regions in which you hope to launch your product. This really illustrates that prior to phase 1, you'd already be starting to talk to the agency about the non-clinical data package potentially to support the clinical trial application, but also shows how things like your PIP or your pediatric plan submission might follow scientific advice. You might seek scientific advice and then go and get a pediatric plan based on that scientific advice, but that pediatric plan might need modified throughout the development process, which would mean that you have to keep going back to the agency. For the orphan designation, you can submit that really at any point in time during the development phase. Most people wait now for some clinical data to show that the product, the product's mechanism of action is likely to have effect in the disease area, and or if there's already products available in that space, in that therapeutic area, that the drug is likely to be better, have what we call a significant benefit over that therapy. And then in this case, it was deemed important because there was no regulatory guidance to have a parallel EMA and FDA scientific advice, so that there was one study to be run that would meet global requirements, which obviously required the study design to be amended to suit both regulators. The ultimate goal of development of the product is obviously achieving a license at the end, and this may seem a very long way off for some of you. However, it is worth noting that the agencies have developed processes and procedures to really support faster and expedited reviews of especially innovative medicines. I definitely won't be going through all of this, but essentially it's just to say that there are lots of different ways in which the agency can expedite a review, and that includes things like shortening the review time, but also looking at packages that perhaps include less than comprehensive data, with the idea that they could approve based on a smaller data package with obligations to then submit further data later on beyond approval. It is important that if you're hoping to take advantage of any of these, that you start talking about about this type of thing and what is needed to support these activities right at the beginning of the development program, because what we clearly see is that the chance of success of either obtaining one of these designations or moving through one of these procedures successfully really depends on an early discussion with the agencies about how and what you need to do to get to the point where they will review your license application in a shorter fashion. And I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to the last section of the presentation, which was a couple of slides to talk about what we've learned, if anything, from COVID. And the development of drugs and vaccines for the COVID. So obviously regulatory affairs and the mechanisms of approvals of licenses has become much more high profile in recent times during the pandemic. And I think from my perspective has only really served to highlight how important interaction with the regulators is, and actually that how successful the vaccine development has really been based on the collaboration between the regulators and the companies themselves. So I wanted to just use two examples to really highlight the theme of my presentation, which is that close collaboration and early dialogue with the regulators is really important, but also that the regulators should be seen as partners and are themselves doing as much as they can to support innovation. And I wanted to highlight that through two case studies, really. One brief case study around something that we're working on in-house. We are working with a company who is developing a COVID treatment, and it's really been quite eye-opening how proactive and helpful the regulators have been in terms of working with us on this. So firstly, the EMA have established a COVID task force, which has been in place since the beginning of the pandemic and meets to discuss development programs for COVID treatments and vaccines with the developers themselves, and really works with them to agree what procedures and expedited procedures the company can have access to. And they've expedited their scientific advice procedure. We've taken advantage of that at least a couple of times, both on clinical and non-clinical, as well as quality issues. So in terms of getting advice now on the basis of maybe a couple of weeks rather than a couple of months as it has been in the past. We've also taken advantage of an ad hoc review by the task force of the phase 3 study design in terms of, and that was totally out with any formal advice procedure to really help inform the final phase 3 study design before the clinical trial applications were filed. The next steps will involve talking with the EMA about their process for a rapid PIP review for COVID treatments, and ultimately we are hoping to take advantage of the rolling review option, which the EMA have introduced specifically for COVID treatments, which involves not waiting for the entire data package for marketing authorization application to be available, but to start reviewing, for example, the non-clinical data in advance and moving through that and reviewing that in advance to expedite approval. We also saw that the MHRA proactively have been reaching out as and when clinical data have been made publicly available and are really readily available for informal advice and guidance. And this really has shown how, with the collaboration between regulators and developers, things can move very, very fast. The question, of course, now is, will we be able to see some of these new mechanisms that have been put in place for COVID to be rolled out for other disease areas, therapies, rare diseases, and serious and life-threatening, other serious and life-threatening diseases. And that's certainly something that's being discussed a lot at the moment. Obviously, all of this takes an incredible amount of resource to make happen. But it would be very useful if we could sort of build on what we've learned from COVID generally. The other slide I had was around the very publicly acknowledged accelerated review of the COVID vaccine, the Moderna COVID vaccine, by the European Medicines Agency. Again, what you'll be able to see from this slide is that at every step there was enhanced collaboration between the EMA and the applicant themselves, and really reduced an approval process that normally couldn't take anywhere from 9 to 15 months up, and this review completed within essentially 3 months. Again, this really required the regulators to assess the data in real time, and they abandoned their structured timetables, etc. But they really showed a willingness to get this on board and to get on board and really do this obviously for public health reasons. So I think Indraj has just a couple of slides on exceptional use authorizations for devices, and then I think we're pretty much out of time.
Yeah, so nationally in Europe, exceptional use for COVID-19 devices has been addressed at a national level. So there's been certain exceptional use authorization schemes. For example, in the UK, the MHRA, fast-tracked approval of medical devices. They've provided specific guidance and routes for products like ventilators, personal protective equipment, and testing kits for COVID-19. So what they've shown here is that they've been really flexible with the exceptional use authorizations, and based on clinical need and where there's clinical evidence for a product and there's been a lack of alternative products, they have allowed devices which have not been CE marked or UKCA marked onto the market. Similarly, the US has also an exceptional use authorization scheme where they've waived quality system requirements and device listing requirements. And these are being reviewed on a rolling basis, and until they're determined not to be needed, the devices will be allowed to be used in specific markets. And on the next slide, I've just got a few examples of some devices which we've all probably used. So things like self-test kits, swabs, examination gloves, masks and respirators, and obviously more important devices like continuous renal replacement therapies and hemodialysis devices, oxygen pressure monitors, ventilators and CPAP devices have all benefited from this exceptional use authorization and been able to hopefully help a lot of people around the world. And that concludes our presentation. I'm not sure if we have any time for questions, but thank you for listening.
Thank you so much indeed, Vicki, Dianne and Indra. That was very impressive. So much information and advice on where to seek advice, how to get to it, specific examples for different indications. So a wealth of knowledge and really interesting. there are no questions. I think you pretty much covered everything, but I do want to highlight for delegates on the call that you can reach out to Vicki and Dianne via the conference app. So if you do have any questions that come to you after the session, then really do use this as an opportunity to make that contact. That's exactly why we put these innovation workshops in place. So you could directly discuss any sort of challenges you had yourself in this specific area. I mean, we are up to time. One question that did occur to me is that you'd raised both Brexit and COVID during the presentation. And I was wondering, do you think the two would play against each other in terms of what that means for developments in the UK going forward? So perhaps COVID might be facilitating because of the improvements in approval processes, although I'm not sure if that's permanent. And then Brexit might be deterring some. So I didn't know if you had any thoughts on whether the two would interplay against each other.
I mean, I think what we're seeing, and I'd probably quite like to highlight in terms of Brexit, is that the MHRA are really stepping up their game. So they have put a tremendous amount of effort into putting some really exciting procedures in place, like and supportive mechanisms in place, like the ILAP, but also they've proactively suggested that already they will permanently put in place a rolling review option, which the EMA have not yet done. So I think actually the MHRA have sort of stepped up and met the challenge of Brexit in terms of making themselves putting in place some really good and exciting opportunities for regulators to for developers to speak to regulators. And actually, from a personal standpoint, I think every interaction I've had with the MHRA in the last few years has really demonstrated the wealth of knowledge there, but also the sheer pragmatism that they can show. And I think I said in one of the case studies really that they've really been quite helpful and creative and really wanted to work with it. So actually, I think that Brexit has allowed the MHRA to really establish some really great processes, and COVID has sort of allowed them to demonstrate that they can do it. So in a way, I think it's worked both you know, both in a positive way. Yeah, but we'll have to wait and see, because of course there's no precedence yet for some of these procedures. There is no precedent yet, so it's impossible to say. But there is a lot of interest from a lot of the companies that we work with on going to the MHRA and investigating what these processes mean for drug development generally.
Thank you, Vicki. Thanks for the reassurance. It's brilliant. Thank you. So it's up to me now just to close the session. And before doing so, I'd just like to highlight that we do have a final innovation workshop at 1:30, sponsored by ARU, and it's actually on the topic of the latest developments in COVID-19 research to come out of ARU. So very interesting indeed. So thank you once again to Vicki, Dianne and Indra for your time. Thanks to everyone for joining, and hope to see you online shortly, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alicia.
Thank you.